and welcome to the I Teach Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 24, Deep Dive, Networking for Ports. So, I mentioned in the last networking deep dive, or in one of the other networking deep dive, about ports, IP addresses, all of that. Just to go over it again, the ports are where you directly connect for specific services on a computer. And so if you have a service that is running, typically it is listening for a communication for a specific port, and it's a specific type of communication that it's listening for. And so if an app attempts to connect to it, let's say you have a mail server and you attempt to connect to it on HTTP, and you expect to just send mail that way. Well, unless the system is specifically handled for that, it won't just allow you to send mail over HTTP. You have to install some sort of plugin or make a service that listens for it. That's kind of how all of this is tied together. Your services are tied to ports, and then your ports will allow you to host specific types of services. Now, on the internet, you're going to have different ports open for different services, of course, but the vast majority, the most popular port that is open is going to be HTTP and HTTPS, which are the ports that allow you to look at web pages. Those are also the ports that are open typically just for APIs. APIs will listen over HTTP and HTTPS, but you can configure all services to listen on different ports, and even those ports that are reserved for other services. It's very possible to do that. Not necessarily recommended, and not possible if you're sharing it over the same machine. Or it is, but there's a lot of technical reasons and technical challenges with that. But anyways, point being is that if you are, port numbers are kind of arbitrary. Really, they're just arbitrary. But we've all sort of agreed that these port numbers mean these things. And so that's what we're going to go over. We're going to go over the most popular ports. And there's a couple of reasons why. Before I start, there's a couple of reasons why you should know ports and their importance. Port numbers are important because you need to understand what services are possibly available, and especially what services are available by default. In a IT certification setting, they're important because you need to know how to connect and where to go for specific types of data. And when you're attempting to navigate the twisty, wild world of networking, the ports will navigate you appropriately to where you're supposed to go, especially by default. And if you're just a business owner that's listening to this and you're just trying to help secure your own environment, it's good to know port numbers, because a lot of vendors, when they install stuff on your network, will say, oh, well, just open up this port to the internet. And that is a bad fucking idea if you don't know what you're doing. So, and don't fucking trust your vendors ever. Don't ever trust a fucking vendor just with what they tell you, because vendors, the guy who's installing your stuff for your vendor is only interested in one thing: his numbers, making sure he installs stuff as fast as possible and the laziest way possible. So don't listen to your fucking vendors. I mean, don't listen to some random guy on the internet either. But anyway, here are some ports. So to start off with, to go over port numbers, there are over 65,000 port numbers, and the actual number of port numbers is 65,536. And if you think that's an oddly specific number, I urge you to go back and look at your powers of two. And that's not a specific number at all. So anyways, there are over 65,000 port numbers to choose from. And so there's a lot of fucking ports. We are not going to go over all 65 fucking thousand of those ports and what they're popularly used for. We're just going to go over the major ports and what they're used for. We might go over some ports that are not necessarily major, but are good to know. So here we go. To start off with, we're going to go ports 22 and 21, 20 and 21. Those are FTP, so File Transfer Protocol. That is an older file transfer protocol. Is an older protocol that we don't typically use a whole lot now, especially considering we have better ways to transfer files, more secure ways to transfer files. FTP is plain text and dangerous, so don't use it if you can avoid it. There's alternative to FTPs. There's FTPS and SFTP, which will allow you to connect over an encrypted connection. One is more secure than the other, but I urge you to investigate that if you are looking to host an FTP server. The next on our list is SSH, or Secure Socket Host. This is a port that is dedicated to the management of your server or the management of your operating system. And so this is a port that basically will allow you to remote into your server. Now, this isn't a remoting like hands on keyboard sort of full interactive GUI. This is a command line interface that you can remote into. Your network devices, your Ubuntu, Linux devices will all have, or should all have, SSH capability. You can have SSH capability on a Windows system, but there is a little kind of challenge to that. Needless to say, SSH, it is encrypted by default now and does have a lot of security features to it. And this is one of the most popular ports that you're going to look for if you're looking to hack. So please don't do that. 23, Telnet. Telnet is the older version of SSH. It is not really older version, I should say. It's a less secure version that does the same thing as SSH. Telnet is an insecure, unencrypted, plain text communication path where you are able to control another device. And eventually, when we get way further into networking, we'll talk about UDP versus TCP and all of that fun mess. And this is a UDP service versus SSH is a TCP service. So there, have fun. Port 25, SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. Woo! This is the port that you utilize to send mail to and from a server. This is unencrypted. There is an encrypted SMTP that we'll cover later. But yes, this is the mail transfer protocol, and this is what you would send to a mail server if it just has SMTP exposed. There is DNS port 53. This is super fun. Dynamic name service. This is where in the scheme of networking, this is the service that hosts the names of the IP addresses. And so this is the phone company in our analogy of an IP address being a phone number. This is who knows who is who on the network. And so when you go and you ping a name, google.com, you'll go and get your 8.8.8.8 or whatever number they have. And so DNS exists on 53. It's important to know that one because you don't want to block it, because then you can't browse the internet. Port 67 and 68. This is DHCP or BootP. These services basically allow for the dynamic addressing of a system. So when you can first connect to a network, your computer doesn't know what IP address it should have. And if you have DHCP services, your computer will send out a broadcast that says, hey, I don't know who I am. I don't know what IP address I should have. And then a DHCP server will respond back with, you get this IP address. And that's how DHCP kind of works. The bad part about DHCP and all of that is that there is a limited number of addresses on the network, and you have to configure it for it to work. It doesn't just automatically work. Now, if you don't have DHCP, you can always manually set an IP address, and we can get into that later. But needless to say, port 67 and 68, important on your network if you have DHCP enabled and you are utilizing DHCP services. Port 69, nice. TFTP. This is another FTP protocol, but this is specifically designed for pre-boot or simple communication. Basically, these are small file transfers that allow you to identify specific systems in a network, rather. The TFTP services are what allow you to do things like configure boot parameters for a pre-boot environment. So, say for instance, you have a computer and a server. That server is configured to host boot images for computers. You use something to host those images, like Clonezilla or another TFTP server. That will broadcast, hey, I'm here constantly. And then when a system is in pre-boot mode and is looking for a network, we're looking for a TFTP solution, it will download the TFTP image from that server. And that's the port 69 is where it will get that from. Port 80, HTTP, important. This is the website protocol, hypertext transfer protocol. This is what you use to send basic web pages over the internet. HTTP port 80 is unencrypted, unsecure. Do not use it anymore if you're hosting a website. Port 80 is the basic form of communication. Now, if you have a network device on your network, chances are that it has HTTP running as a service. I guarantee you, your shitty little printer that you bought from HP, it's got HTTP enabled. Your router probably has HTTP enabled. Your switches might have HTTP enabled. But yeah, needless to say, this is how you would connect to those devices, and this is how we used to connect to things over the internet. Port 88, Kerberos. This is the authentication protocol for Windows. And it is important to know this port because if you block it, you stop Kerberos authentication and therefore stop your ability to communicate over the network. So your Active Directory authentications will fail. It's a little bit more advanced than some of you might be comfortable with, but whatever, deal with it. Port 123, Network Time Protocol 123. This is the protocol that you utilize to sync your clocks across the internet. Time sync is incredibly important on the internet. It is how we verify when packets are sent and what order they are sent in. If you are changing your clock constantly, you can fuck with some network gear, let me tell you. Anyways, NTP is the protocol which you would sync the clock. And there are things called NTP servers scattered around the internet. You can host your own if you really want to. But NTP servers host the exact time for everything to sync to. And so very occasionally, your computer will sync its time to whatever time there is on the NTP server. Now, there is a certain thing called time drift that will occur on your computer as it's powered on, powered off, as you play games, as you run operations, as you eat CPU. Time will drift and you'll need to resync it so that way you're not fucking with your own internet connection. And the way you would do that is by NTP. There's no other real good method to do that. There are, but overly complicated and not really within the scope of what we're talking about here. Port 135, RPC, RPC is a service that allows you to call remote functions against a computer, remote procedure call. And this allows you to identify, this port allows you to go into a Microsoft system and remotely control specific pieces of it. Not necessarily terribly important, terribly useful for normal people, but definitely one of those ports they'll ask you about in a certification test. Moving on. NetBIOS 137 to 139. NetBIOS is basically a legacy protocol that allows for name identification and domain identification. Not really used all that much today, but it's 137 through 139. Good to know. Let's see here. Port 161 and 162, SNMP, simple name. Fuck, I forgot what this one is. Hold on. Simple Network Management Protocol. That's what it means, and I'm an idiot for forgetting it. But this is how you manage network devices on a network. Basically, this is how you would communicate to another device and find out basic information about it using a public stream. You can use an OID. Not really. This is all way too technical for this stupid little port. But anyways, this is how you would manage or find information out about another device on your network. Super useful. See here, we're gonna scroll. We're gonna launch all the way to port 389 LDAP. This is LDAP is a protocol at which you can pull an Active Directory or other management server for specific information. So, in terms of LDAP on an Active Directory server, if you have LDAP exposed, you can utilize single sign-on services so that you can only have one username or password associated with multiple services. And LDAP is how you would do it. Now, there is another LDAP that is more secure on another port that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Port 443, HTTP over SSL. This is the secured version of HTTP. Port 80. So port 443 and port 80 are almost exactly the same, except port 80 is unencrypted and port 443 is encrypted. This is what you utilize a security certificate for. And so now if you connect to a port 80 device and it has been set up with any sort of intelligence, it will automatically redirect you to port 443. And if you don't have an appropriate security certificate assigned to that service or server, you will get an error message that says something like this. This communication is insecure because the browser can't trust the certificate that's attached to it. So, good to know for all sorts of reasons, because 443 is the most used port on the internet. See here, next one is port 465 SMTP over SSL. Again, simple mail transfer protocol. This is one of the secured alternatives for that. Port 465, just like HTTPS or port 443, it requires a certificate and is more secure. Moving on, port 514, syslog. This one is really good. Syslog is how we communicate events on remote devices to other devices, and syslog is the method of which we do that. Whether it's encrypted, unencrypted, UDP, TCP, it's port 514. Everything for syslog communicates over port 514. And you would forward this port if you are trying to communicate logs from one device to another. Again, remember that because it's important. It's good to use. Moving on down the line. Port 587. This is the other secure port for SMTP 587. So 587, 25, and 465. Those three ports are all SMTP, and important because the higher ones are more secure. Those are encrypted. So yeah, remember that. Woo. Port 636. This is LDAP with security over SSL. LDAP over SSL or secured LDAP. This is the same as LDAP before on 389, but port 636 is encrypted. All that communication, all those passwords that you were transferring over the network are now encrypted. There's no more plain text passwords, which is important. Please, 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 for the love of fucking God, please fucking encrypt your communications. Moving on down this line, there is now port 1433 or 1433 and port 1434. This is SQL. Microsoft SQL. This is the default port for SQL. These are good to know because any database connection you have will probably utilize Microsoft SQL communication. And it's important. It's important to have open because when you see these ports, that's the service that is open. And that's how we tell when we're doing some sort of network assessment. That's how we tell if something's a SQL server. It has those ports open. So, yeah. Woo! Port 1337. I know I'm going out of order here, but I just thought of it. Port 1337 is the elite port. So if you see this open, you've probably been hacked. Sorry, bro. 1337 is one of those ports that script kiddies love to use. And so if you have a service running on port 1337 that you did not set up yourself, chances are somebody else set it up because this is not a standard use port. Sorry. Moving on down this line, port 1812 and 1813 is Radius. It's a long, complicated acronym that I suck at remembering, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't care. But Radius is an authentication platform that allows you to authenticate to specific servers. And the way you typically go about doing this is utilizing port 1812 and 1813. Good to know. Let's see here. Moving on. Port 3389 is remote desktop or terminal server. And so if you are connecting to a desktop virtualization platform, you are typically going to start by connecting over 3389. If you see 3389 on the internet, that means somebody has a web server that is communicating over that. And if you have an older web server, that's the port you're going to use to attack to do things like Bluekeep or other really nasty worm shit on that port. So 3389 is RDP or Terminal Services. Port 4333 is another SQL connection. It is MSQL, and it is important to know. Maybe I should just list all these SQL ports over because there are more, and I skipped one. There is 1433, 1434, 3306, and 4333. Those are all SQL ports. 5432 is also a SQL port. These are different branches and different kinds of SQL connections. 4333 is MSQL, 3306 is MySQL, 1433 and 1434 are Microsoft SQL, and 5432 is Postgres SQL. Whew, lots of SQL connections. It's important to know because databases are one of those things that everybody's looking to manipulate and conquer. Port 4444. On the cheat sheet that I'm using to reference this on, they call it Blaster, but all basic hacking kits, when you're setting up a service, by default, a lot of hacking kits, a lot of these services are set up on port 4444. So if you see a service 4444 open on your network, one, you got hacked, and two, the guy who hacked you was too lazy to change the port to something that was reasonably not suspicious. So port 4444, if you see it, you may have been hacked. Let's go down this line, see if there's anything else on here. There's a lot of other various services that they have on this list, things like VMware servers. There's internet radio that they have on here. None of these are actually very popularly used, and a lot of these are simply just fucking connections. I don't know why they have these on the cheat sheet, because it's Half-Life 27015. Oh my god, come on. That's kind of useless for purposes here. Anyways, port 8080 is an HTTP proxy, and there are quite a few other HTTP proxies on this list. And I'll give you guys this list in the show notes so you can view it yourself and mock me as I forget a lot of shit. But port 8080 is HTTP proxy, and basically all you need to know is this is just another HTTP port. It's one of those popular ones that certain services will broadcast or will have their HTTP service exposed on. And so if you have another network device that you're attempting to connect to, you might try port 8080. You also might try port 4433 as well. But other than that, those are all of the big major ports that you need to connect to or need to remember for any sort of certification, and also really for any sort of security purposes, and remembering what the big ones are to avoid for your shitty vendor who wants to open up everything to the internet. Again, I will include this same cheat sheet I've been using in my show notes, so that way you guys can have it and hopefully utilize it for good and not for evil. But I'm sure I forgot a lot of ports, and as I make more of these network deep dives, I will probably target those. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day.